Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Evaluating Impact Logic Models and Timelines, Essential Tools from Program Assessment and Implementation with presenter Diane Gout. My name is Valerie, and I work with Redwind Consulting as the Training and Technical Assistant Advisor. I will be the room moderator for this webinar. Before we begin, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including not limited to housing and homelessness, elder abuse, responses to urban Native survivors, and tribal comprehensive TTA award. This project is supported by grant number 15JOV W21228-TRIB award from the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication, program, exhibition are those of the authors and not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. Without further ado, I would like to give space for speaker Diane Gout to briefly introduce themselves.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Gout. I am the principal and co-owner of Gray Oak LLC, which is my consulting business. We're working with tribal communities across the country on data collection and evaluation. And I've been doing that work for about 25 years now, and I've been working in the field of violence against women for over 30. And yeah, I'm excited to share this information with everyone. Today, we're gonna cover logic models and timelines and why those are really important to your work, particularly when you're laying out the groundwork for your projects and your programs. Next slide. I've been in the teaching field for 27 years. So, go back one. So a lot of people are hearing more and more about what logic models, because we're state, federal, and a lot of foundations are now requiring them as part of grant proposals. So when you're submitting your grant proposal, they're asking you to provide, a lot of times it looks like it's in the form of just a table, but really they want you to take all of the goals and objectives that you've identified in the timeline within your project in narrative form and put it into a visual that allows them to see at glance what exactly it is that you're going to be doing with your work. And so that's exactly what it is. It's a visual representation of your project or your program. And it's something that, most times you're going to create this at the outset of your programming. But if I get asked to come in and do an evaluation partway through a program, what I'll do is sit down with the organization, and we'll create a logic model if they don't have one, so that we can walk through it and see if we have all the elements that we need moving forward to be able to do that evaluation. So not only is it important in sort of constructing your program or your project, but it's also a really useful tool when you're conducting your evaluation and assessment of the program or project. Next slide. So essentially what a logic model, and this is one that it's very simple, that you can look online, you're going to see a whole lot of different types, and some of them can be quite complicated. But for our purposes, we don't, I think simpler is easier. And what they really do is they help us better understand the relationships between the different elements that are going to help us develop and deliver our work. So, how do our inputs relate to our objectives and so forth, and to our activities? when you're thinking about planning your programming, when you're thinking about implementing your programming, monitoring your programming, and evaluating your programming, these, your logic model is really essential to that. So, it's saying, what are you planning to do? And then what do you expect to see as a result of that work? Because we all have an idea about that. And really, when you're thinking about sort of in your own mind, why you're choosing to engage in to develop the program you have, or to expand programming, or to create, projects, it really comes down to really wanting to, you have an idea of what it is you're trying to achieve. So in this particular example, I always start with the situation. So if somebody's looking at this, they're going to look at it and see immediately why this is important. Why is this project important, or your program? And here we're saying, by 2050, the American Indian Alaska Native population is expected to reach 8.6 million in the U.S. And then research indicates 4 out of 5 Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. Well over half experience sexual and physical violence by an intimate partner, and over 2/3 have experienced psychological aggression. So right now we're saying, we're really sort of laying out why this is really important, right? Why is this something that's necessary? So when someone reads that, they're going to go, oh, wow, okay, so then what's our goal? And then you're going to indicate what that goal is. And so that's the goal of your overarching project. And then we're going to think about, okay, so what are the different inputs we have? And your inputs are, what kind of budget are we looking at? What kind of staffing do we have? If this was going to be like a housing thing, do we actually have housing that we're going to actually be able to get people into? Do we have our organizational input? So a lot of times we'll put whether or not we have a board and how many board members you have. Whether or not, your overall operating budget and what that looks like. Do you have partners? Do you have partners that are in this project? Because those are going to be your part of your inputs as well. And so really sort of being able to get all of that down. And then when you're thinking about your, target population, right? Who is it that this specific project is geared towards, and identifying who that target population is. At the bottom of this, I always like to have some assumptions. So, that doing this work here is complex. It requires specialized knowledge, strong collaborations, an understanding of sovereignty in indigenous ways, that, this organization that's putting this funding request forward has that expertise, right? So that, they're seeing what your situation is, they're seeing how you're planning to address it, and then they're seeing that you have the capacity and the expertise in order to address that. And so really it's like this glance, it's your roadmap. And then you're going to move through this, and we've talked about this on some of the other presentations, is sort of, what are your objectives? So what are those things that, you're going to undertake that's going to get you closer to your goal, what those activities are, what those outputs are. So again, not confusing those with outcomes. Those outputs would be if you're going to do training as part of your activity, then the outputs, how many of those are you going to do and how many people are you going to train? And then the outcomes is like, what changes, what behaviors change, does knowledge change, how are people transformed? There's short-term outcomes, there's longer-term outcomes. Most often programs are at the shorter-term outcomes, because long-term outcomes require, being able to follow someone over time and to be able to capture that. And sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge, particularly if you're, part of this is related to survivors. And so, it's hard to keep track of where they go. So, this is sort of that visual representation of the project you're proposing to do and what you expect to see as a result of that project. So next slide. So just as an example, let's walk through this a little bit. So, we have this program that we have, it's a justice program. Our goal is to provide, culturally sensitive services to American Indian and Alaska Native victims and increase awareness of teen dating violence. So, some of our inputs, we have our organizational profiles. So we're a nonprofit. We have, board members. There are 6. We have 8 full-time staff, 2 part-time staff, 3 volunteers, and the budget for this project is going to be $500,000. So that's what we have. That's a tangible that's going to, assist us in getting this done. Our target population is American Indian and Alaska Native youth, so it's very specific. Our objectives, that are related to that goal is to develop and deliver an array of services to victims of teen dating violence, to coordinate services and strengthen partnerships with local schools and youth organizations, and then finally to develop and deliver community awareness and public education. And so you can kind of see how those objectives tie to supporting that goal of providing services and increasing awareness. So some of the activities that are related to those are develop and implement a trauma-informed care model and practices, and then provide opportunities for clients to participate in cultural ceremonies and activities. Then develop collaborations with local middle and high school and youth centers, formalize MOUs with identified partners, and then create a youth task force. So, you can kind of see how each one of these is connected. And then finally, create a prevention campaign, host community education and awareness events, and then provide education and awareness to youth. So you see your objectives, you see the activities that are tied to those objectives. And then your outputs, again, those are your counts. So we're going to serve at least 30 youth victims by the end of year 3. And if you were on the goals and objectives, if you've seen that presentation, then everything needs to be measurable and it needs to be reasonable, right? So if you're setting good goals and objectives, then one of them is going to be within your capacity to do that. It's going to be something that you can measure, and it's going to be within a time frame that you can get it accomplished. Provide access to traditional ceremonies and cultural activities for at least 30 youth. And what you'll notice there is saying provide access. So, we don't necessarily, they may not need it or want it, but what you're doing is you're providing the access, because we can't ensure that anybody engages in any of that, right? But what our goal here is to make sure that they have the opportunity. And then conduct monthly clinical case consultations and care coordination meetings to make sure that, we're meeting the needs of the youth. Then in the second piece with the services, we're going to engage in at least 1 meeting each quarter with MOU partners by the end of year 3, again, measurable. Engage in at least 1 task force meeting each quarter by the end of year 3. And then finally, we're going to create at least 3 prevention campaigns with the youth task force. So we're going to engage the youth and creating services and awareness that's going to address youth. And then we're going to engage in at least 6 awareness and educational activities by the end of year 3. So outputs, counts, what are we going to do? How many are we going to do? And how many people? And then finally, your outcomes, again, are going to be like the change in behavior and knowledge. And so we're going to increase identification of AIA and youth victims of teen dating violence. We're going to increase awareness of teen dating violence and healthy relationships among youth in middle and high schools, enhance the skills and practice of staff addressing teen dating violence, increase in awareness of teen dating violence among educators and community members. So that's all of that's, through our collaborations, and then increase in participation of youth survivors in cultural ceremonies, classes, and activities. And so those are short-term, right? If those would be your short-term outcomes. And if we were looking at longer-term outcomes, then one of the things we would want to try to do is follow those youth. So we would follow them over a period of time, and then we would perhaps survey them or interview them or have them in focus groups and find out what their being involved, if they were involved in these cultural ceremonies and activities, like what change did that make in their lives? How did that affect their lives in some way? What did that do in terms of connecting it to healthy relationships? And we would look at that over time, because it takes a little time for those kinds of changes to be able to show themselves, right? So this is just an example of what, if you're creating your logic model, what that would look like. And on the other page, we'd already talked a little bit about, I would have at the top the situation and the bottom the assumptions, and I would relate those specifically to youth, right? For the sake of having enough room on the page, I didn't include them here because the examples are on the other page. But sort of thinking about, what would we want related to youth in the situation, and talking about youth and teen dating violence, particularly Native youth, and then why your organization is in the best position to be able to address and to engage in this project. Next slide. So when we're thinking about logic models and evaluation, they're really essential. I think that it's very challenging to do an evaluation and not have a bit of an understanding of why people choose to engage in certain to develop that project, to engage in those activities, to choose those objectives and the goals, because if you can understand sort of the rationale for that, then it makes it easier going forward and being able to evaluate that. So, how does this get incorporated into it? Usually, like I said before, it happens at the end when people have to do their evaluation, and then that people come in to try to do that. And when it's me, if I get brought in, other than at the beginning of the project, towards the middle or the end of the project, that's one of the things that I work with the program to do, is to go back and we're gonna create a logic model so that I can better understand sort of what your ideas were and why you chose this way to do this work. And so it's always best if you have it at the beginning of the project. And logic models are one of those tools that you want it to be sort of a living document. So it's something where you're pulling it out, you're examining it, or is this exactly what we thought we were going to accomplish? Are we on track for accomplishing these objectives and these activities? Is there something going on where we've had to pivot? If you have to pivot and you have to change your activities related to your objectives. So I think, as an example, project I was doing, we were going to do focus groups, and then COVID happened, and we had to regroup, and we had to think about, are there other ways to meet these objectives that it's not going to be through focus groups? And we ended up pivoting and changing that to interviews. So sort of being able to look at that and think, okay, what are other ways that we might have to adjust to get this work done? And having that sort of logic model allows you with that ability to have something to look at and then to modify it if you need to. The other piece of this is that, one of the things you're really going to be looking at when you're thinking about your evaluation, right, is that whole question of what difference did this program or this project make? And being able to sort of have an idea when you're looking at your outcomes of what you thought you were going to be able to do is going to be really beneficial, because, especially if you're in the middle of, it's a 3 or 5 year project, and somebody leaves, then you have this thing left behind that somebody else coming in would be able to look at it and go, oh, okay, that makes sense. So this is what I see that they were hoping to achieve with this. So some of the things you're going to be thinking about are, whether or not your program or project's on the right track, and, are you addressing the right issues? And when you create that logic model, those are the things that are, because it's a lot, that there's the term logic for a reason. It's like, do these things make sense? Do they connect to one another? And if you can't draw a thread between your goal, your objective, your activities, your outputs, and your outcomes, if they're not completely connected to one another, then you're off somewhere, right? So, if you're thinking that you're gonna be creating this project with youth, and you include something in there as an outcome that has to do with the parents of youth, but you haven't identified them anywhere else in your logic model, then once you get to that outcome and you got to draw it backwards and take those steps back, you're going to see that that doesn't make sense to have that outcome because you didn't include any activities and you didn't include any objectives that related to parents, right? So that's one of the benefits of it as well, because we have these great ideas, and then when we start to write it down, we're like, oh, well, we can't get there from here. That's a saying we have in Maine, is you can't get there from here. And that's the same thing with your logic model, is that you might see that. So, some of the things you're going to also be looking at is, did our program or our project engage in the right tasks to accomplish our goals? And so that's what I'm going to be looking. I'm going to say, these are the things you were planning to do. Did those make sense? Were you able to meet your goal by these particular activities and objectives? Did it make a difference to the clients that you're serving? And so, and here we talk about the youth, right? So, do you see a change there? Is it somehow transformative for them? And how are we going to measure that? What does that look like? Has it made a difference in our community? Is having this available to youth, and youth being able to identify healthy relationships. And again, that's like one of those longer term goals or outcomes that you could look at, is that, does that change the dynamics of the community all when you start to have these things available? And, when I started this work a long time ago, I remember going into tribal communities, and there were only a handful that actually had domestic violence codes. And so if you're thinking about that now, almost everybody has domestic violence codes. And how did that transform the community? It created an awareness about, domestic violence that was a little bit different. It wasn't that there already was an awareness, but it brings it out more, right? And so how does some of these activities affect the community that you're engaged in with your projects? If there's any barriers or gaps that pop up. So for example, if you've got all of these opportunities for youth to engage in cultural activities, and then you find out they're not engaging in cultural activities at all, then you can't really measure that, right? You can't say, hey, this was successful, because you're not able to, none of them partook. So that might be a barrier or a gap that you need to go back and say, well, what happened here? It seemed like such a great idea, but can we find out why youth were reluctant to participate? And then that becomes part of your evaluation and your assessment. And then at the end of all of this, always is like, how can we improve? Because that's the goal of really all of the work that we're doing. And the reason for an evaluation is, how can we do this better? Are there areas where we need to improve? And what does that look like? And so, in a lot of ways, logic models, we really want them, they're not really linear. They show up on the page linear, but they're not really linear. And so, being able to sort of think of them in a circular way. So, you've got these pieces that you're creating all this input, and you're sort of going around. And then once you have your outcomes, it's like, how can you take that information and infuse it back into your program or your project, and either expand your project, improve your project, create a new project, right? It's sort of that circular piece of, keeping that information flowing forward. Next slide. So, are there limitations? There's always limitations, right? And so one of the things is that, logic models can't always account for unintended consequences. And really, when we create them, we're creating them on our best understanding of what we hope to accomplish with the activities that we think are going to get us there. And so that's why earlier I said, you really want to be thinking of these as working documents. So it's not, hey, we're going to develop this logic model, we're going to attach it to our grant proposal, and we're never going to look at this again. Because you're missing a great opportunity to be able to say, do we need a little course correction here? Is there something else going on? And it allows you an opportunity to change things based on real-time immediate information. So again, you know, with the example of we were going to do the focus groups, and then COVID happens and there's no focus groups happening. There's no traveling happening. You know, we have to say, okay, so let's pull out our logic model and our timeline, which I'm going to get to in a minute. And we need to figure out, how can we adjust? What do we need to change? How do we need to change it? What's going to get us the information we need? You know, generally speaking, in focus groups, you can get more people in a group than if you're doing interviews. If you're conducting interviews, that takes more time. You know, I can do a focus group for 2 or 3 hours, and I can have 15 people, and I'm going to get a lot of information from 15 people in 3 hours. But in interviews, I'm only going to interview 3 people in an hour, or in 3 hours, right? Generally speaking, and maybe not even that, depending if the interview goes longer. So what that means is that that's going to put a different strain on the budget. And then we have to go back and say, okay, do we have the funds for that? And so this gives you that opportunity to be able to sort of reevaluate and reassess. And, you know, if you don't have that document and you're trying to just sort of comb through, you know, your grant, it makes it really, it's a little more challenging, and especially to make sure everybody's on the same page. It's also that sort of accountability piece. So, you know, making sure when you go back to it, it's like, well, you know, did we do these activities? And if we didn't do these activities, why didn't we do these activities? And being able to sort of hold yourselves accountable. And with accountability comes transparency, and particularly for yourselves and your funder. So you can go back and, you know, be able to document to your funder, hey, this is what happened here, and this is why we had to do this differently. And I've seen situations where people had to go back to the funder and ask for more funds because of the challenges that came up in trying to get the project going. And so, you know, then you have your data for that justification. So the other part of that is it's looking at timing. And so is the timing working on this? You know, you want to make sure you have enough time to be able to do all the work that you're trying to do. And when you're looking at that document, that illustration of your work, you know, if you've got 15 activities for each objective and it's a 2-year grant, you really have to sort of look and go, okay, so we might not be able to do all of these. This might not be reasonable. So what are the things that are essential? What are the things that we might get to if we have time? But you know, if you're over, you know, being over eager, over ambitious in this, then it's going to show up on that page looking at it all at one time. So that makes it also a very valuable resource as well. Next slide. So with that, you know, having your logic model is being able to create the timeline. And, you know, to me, the timelines are essential, and really, you know, they coordinate really well with your logic model, because if you've got sort of, this is what we want to do, and then this is the time frame in which we think we can accomplish all of this work in this logic model, that's also going to be also that sort of reality check of, is this even possible? Can we do this? You know, your timeline should include the lists of tasks that you're going to complete and the dates they need to be completed by, how long you think it's going to take to get those done, when you'll begin working and when you expect to be finished, and which of those tasks are dependent on the other tasks. So for example, if you know you're going to provide services to youth, but you need to be able to hire somebody, a youth advocate, then those services are going to come after you have the youth advocate. Therefore, those services are dependent upon that youth advocate. A lot of timelines, sometimes people put them into just a chart, a Word document chart. The most common is a Gantt chart. It's been used forever. It's easy to look at. You use the horizontal bars to sort of show how far you're going to get with it and what you think you're going to do. And so, and a lot, again, much like the logic models, a lot of the funders are asking for these now to be incorporated with the grant application. And so on the next slide, we'll have a little example of one. So this was the project that I was working on, and the project was to increase access by sexual assault survivors. And there were a lot of pieces to this particular project. And the first piece of that was the needs assessment. And then, and there was a lot more than this, but this will just give you an idea. So, part of this was we were going to form an advisory panel, and we were going to hold an advisory meeting. And then we were going to draft all of our instruments for our needs assessment, and have another advisory board meeting. And then we were going to actually conduct our work. And then there was the analysis piece, additional advisory board meetings. And then in our next objective, we were going to start to implement recommendations. And so those recommendations were to provide those specialized services. And so, going through this, it's, we broke this down into quarters because this particular grant had, it was a 3-year grant. So we did this in quarters to make it a little easier. Some people will choose to do it monthly and show it by month. And so, you can do that too. The more discrete your timeline is, the better. It makes it a lot easier. So that helps you identify when there's hiccups and you kind of get delayed on something. It might be, for example, if one of the things was we were going to hire somebody, we could just put hire, let's say a sexual assault advocate, right? And put that at Q1. But it makes more sense if you're saying that to identify all the tasks that go along with that. So you need to develop your job description, and then you need to get that approved in this particular community. Then it needs to be approved by tribal administration. And then you're going to post that job description, and then you're going to receive and review the applications, and then you're going to conduct interviews, and then you're going to do select a person, and then you're going to do the onboarding and training, right? So that's like 7 additional tasks right there just for hiring for this position. And if you detail all those tasks, what you might find out is might not get done in the first quarter, right? Depending on how long that can take. And I know that since the pandemic, it's been taking a whole lot longer for people to get employed and getting positions filled. So, that's something that if everything's contingent on getting that person hired, and you say you're going to get them hired in the first month and start services in month 2, that's an unrealistic expectation. So having a really detailed timeline makes sure that you're giving yourself enough wiggle room to sort of do this work. So, like things like in this one, we're going to do the focus group, but transcribed focus groups, it gave myself 6 months to get all of that work done, because that can take a while, and especially when you're doing other things. So you want to be able to look at this and say, well, what other things are overlapping with the work that we're trying to accomplish, and does that make sense? And is it the same person doing that work, or are they different people doing that work? And so a lot of times what people will include in their timelines as well is the people who are going to be assigned to those different tasks. So, making sure that, like I said, when you do these, it can be as simple as you want it to be, but my recommendation is always to have it as detailed as you can have it, because that's where you're going to be able to sort of figure out what it is you need to do. Kind of like baking a cake. You want to make sure you have all of the ingredients laid out so you can look at those ingredients and see if you're missing something. And if you're missing something, then you're going to go to the store and you're going to get it. Trying to recall things is a real challenge about what you think it needs to have. So making sure that you've got all of those pieces in place is going to really help you with your project. Next slide. So sort of to summarize that, you want to, just going through all of this is be realistic. If your program provides services to victims, you can't address an outcome that, that has something to do with offenders unless you put that in there specifically. And so making sure that what you're thinking you're going to do, it ties directly to your outcome. So it's like being able to sort of draw that thread through everything. The other piece is make sure you're able to gather the data you're going to need. So, if you are saying we're going to, survivors are going to feel more empowered, economically empowered because they attended our program that had to do with teaching them financial literacy and all of those pieces, then you need to be able to interview and talk to those survivors. So you need to have a mechanism by which you're going to be able to collect that. So make sure that whatever you say you're going to do as your outcomes, that you're actually able to collect the data to measure that. Realistically, like I said, you're going to be looking at measuring short-term outcomes. That doesn't mean that you can't do longer-term outcomes. Sometimes what I'll do, even for like training and technical assistance, is we'll collect the information immediately, like how do people think they're going to utilize the information that they've gotten, how they plan to utilize it, if they think they're going to encounter any barriers, what do they think they might do to overcome those? And then 6 months later, I'll survey them again and say, hey, were you able to do this? Did you, what do you think that the benefits of this, the work that you engaged in 6 months earlier was, and how do you see it as being effective and successful and transformative? And, follow them for a little while, and then maybe follow them another 6 months later. And so, there's ways of being able to do that. Some populations make it a little harder than others, but there are ways to be able to collect that longer term information. Not confusing your activities with goals and objectives, right? So the activities are like, what are we doing? Those steps we're taking, if something's not working, you can go in and you can absolutely change it and rework it. You don't have to stick with what you originally wrote down if it's not working. And I think we learned that during COVID, is that there were a lot of different ways that we can achieve the same outcomes that are not necessarily the original way that we thought, right? But we can rework things. They're fluid. It doesn't have to be something that's sort of, static, and that, our logic models are living, breathing documents. It's sort of the same way that our data is. Our data is it's all living, breathing. It represents a human experience. These logic models represent your programming and your vision and what you want to achieve. And the outcomes are tied to your communities and to the people you serve. So they're living, breathing documents, and that's the way you should think about them. Your timelines are a great visual for being able to keep you on track and to, sort of keep you accountable to what you were going to do, and to also give you some space to say this was really overambitious and this didn't work, and these are the 3 or 4 reasons why, and be able to document that so that, one, you have that for your funder, but even more importantly, you have it for yourself. So when you do your next project, you're able to think about it a little more realistically based on real-time information. So yeah, we can't get somebody hired in 1 or 2 months. It actually, because of all the processes we have to go through, it takes us 3 months. And so making sure every time that you are gonna hire somebody, that you're building that time in, right? That it sort of creates that space for you to be able to do that, and having those timelines. And you don't want to do this work in a vacuum. You want to do this work with a team. And so when you're thinking about, when you're writing grants, as being able to write them as a team, like, does this make sense? Are these the outcomes that we're thinking we're going to achieve? What's the best way to do this? And if you have somebody come in and do grant writing for you, then making sure they give you a logic model and they include you in the development of that, because sometimes, and a timeline, right? So if they're creating a timeline for you that says, hey, you're going to get this done in this amount of time, you're like, well, that's not how that works here. There's no possible way we're going to get that done this fast. Then you want to make sure if they give you a logic model and a timeline with your grant, you don't have to sit there and try to comb through that whole grant. You can look at that right away immediately and say, yeah, I don't see how this is going to work, and how are the outcomes attached to these objectives, because they don't seem like they relate, and have that process of them talking you through that, because every part of it should be something that is so clear and so easy for anyone who looks at it to understand how you're going to get from point A to Z, right? And all the ways in which you're going to travel to make it from that point to the end point. You know, when you're doing this work, the other thing is that what you want to make sure of is you're committing some real resources to your work. So, you know, when you're thinking about your inputs for your project and your evaluation, is, do we have the resources available, and looking at that budget and saying, does that make sense? You know, because if you don't, then everything's going to sort of fall apart anyway. And, you know, if you're looking at this and saying, you know, we're going to be able to pay a new staff person X, but everybody now is expecting to get paid Y, then those resources aren't there for you, and there's no other way for you to get them. You're not going to get somebody hired. And so really making sure that you're looking at your inputs and you're connecting them to the rest of the work to see if it's even doable, because there's nothing more frustrating than having a good idea and a good vision and you don't have the resources to be able to do that. And that really is important to the evaluation piece of this too, because you know, you want to bring somebody in at the beginning so that they can start creating that evaluation plan with your logic model. So you have your logic model for your project and your programming, but then you're going to have your logic model for your evaluation and how you're going to be able to achieve those and measure for those outcomes. Collecting data at the end of a project is really challenging, because that means that you're doing retrospective data collection. And I always ask people, you know, what did you eat 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday night? And the majority of people are not going to be able to tell you. I can't even tell you what I ate 2 days ago. So, you know, if you're asking them to recall an experience from 2 or 3 years ago, that's going to be problematic for almost everybody, right? So you're trying to piece something together that's going to be really, really difficult to do. So having a tracking method up front, and then being able, even if you don't have the evaluator working with you throughout the entirety of the project, but they help you set up how you're going to do the evaluation, and then they come in at the, you know, maybe in checkpoints to see how the collection's going. Is it making sense? Are you running into any challenges? That's going to really help you in the success of your project and your evaluation. So make sure you put some real resources and time to that evaluation piece. Next slide. Hey, so this is one of the shorter presentations. It is pretty kind of straightforward. There's not a whole lot a lot more that you can say with logic models and timelines. But are there any questions, comments? Are people familiar with doing these? And you can put it in chat or ask.
So I've been monitoring the room, and it doesn't look like there's any questions right now. There are quite a few people online. I think there's about 5 people online right now. So let me know if anyone has a question. And if not, if you do have questions, you can also email Diane as well.
Yeah, and we can provide some technical assistance on this. So if you've got a project coming up and you need to develop a logic model or a timeline, and you want to do some work with us, then we can do that as well, and we can help you with that, and one-on-one. So, that's also an option for you.
All righty. Do you have anything else to mention, Diane, before we close?
No, I think I'm good. If anybody else has
I do have
anything.
one question. Let's
Okay.
see. Oh, it says the chat is disabled. I wanted to ask, oh, she wanted to say thank you for taking the time to do this webinar. Oh,
Oh, you're very welcome,
and that was
Maxine.
Maxine.
Yeah. Oh,
And
hi,
Amber.
Amber. You're welcome. It's good to see you on here. I haven't seen your face, but to see you on here.
Oh, Amber did say something. Let's see. Give me 1 second.
Oh, I was just going to say hi back. Thank you so much, Diane. I think that your presentation was very informative. You answered, like, I was thinking things, and before I had the opportunity to write down my question, you were answering it. So I was like, oh, okay, well, perfect. Like, so that was part of, I was like, good, thanks. That's exactly what I wanted to know. So thank you. It was a great job.
All right. Well, if you have any questions, just let me know.
Hi, Diane. My name is Victoria Ferguson Young. I apologize if you may have mentioned this already. I had to step away for a moment, but are there any additional resources you recommend just to like read and review on what you discussed today?
Oh, Diane, you're talking.
So I couldn't hear.
Can you
What?
hear me? Is that any better?
Huh?
Can you hear me? No?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, I apologize. My computer's been giving me issues with Zoom. But I just wanted to know, did you have any other resources that you recommend on logic models?
Like what kind of resources?
Well, just anything else that may expound upon. I'm not super familiar with them, so I'd like to just learn more. So it's just anything like maybe with kind of, that really just elaborates on what you discussed today.
Yeah, so I can send you some. If
Okay.
you want to send me an email, I can send you some that could be helpful.
Okay, great. Sounds good. Thank you so much. I'll email
You're
you.
welcome.
All righty. Does anyone else have a question that they wanted to ask? Okay. Thank you, Diane Gout. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded onto Redwind's YouTube channel and within the next few days. You can also view and find previous recordings there. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenter, Diane Gout. I'd like to thank our captioner, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see everyone within our next webinars in the future. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.